My name is Jason Chatfield, and I'm a cartoonist and a comedian working in New York City. I'm originally from Perth in Western Australia, which is the most isolated capital city on the planet. About 10 years ago, I inherited the writer and artist mantle of Australia's most widely syndicated comic strip, Ginger Meggs, which is about a little red-headed kid. He's like Australia's version of Dennis the Menace. I was a big fan of Ginger Meggs as a kid, and it's the most iconic comic strip in Australian history, and I grew up with it, my parents grew up with it, my grandparents grew up with it. It started in 1921, and there's been 4 other artists before me that wrote and drew it. I actually was asked to take it over by the previous artist, my predecessor, James Kemsley, who was a friend and mentor of mine, and a few days before he died, he asked me if I would take it over, which was a very bittersweet way to inherit a massive honor. The cartoonists that I admire have the same thing in common. Their style is very well defined. So I always grew up looking at like Paul Rigby, who was an Australian editorial cartoonist, who was brilliant. He had excellent draftsmanship, but he had a clear influence from like Ronald Searle, who I also admired, and Gerald Scarfe, and Ralph Steadman, people who were audacious enough to have a style that was so different, but it brilliantly brought out what was in their head. Sergio Aragonis from Mad Magazine, I always just admired all of his cartoons. Mort Drucker, who did the movie parodies in Mad. Al Jaffe, who did the fold-ins. Mad Magazine was a huge influence on me. Jack Davis, Tom Richmond, all those guys, the usual gang of idiots. I have a giant list of people who inspired me and stylistically influenced me. Illustrators like Stanley Chow, who does the biopics for the New Yorker magazine. Also New Yorker cartoonists like Mort Gerberg and Sam Gross and Charles Adams. People who were able to tell a joke without even writing a word, you know, visual gag cartoonists. I have a lot of respect for animators, really good animators like Bobby Pontius. There's a bunch of Disney animators that I follow on Tumblr that are so good that it makes me want to give up and become a bus driver. But then they also inspire me to get better. Paul Rigby, editorial cartoonists who day in, day out had a daily deadline. Comic strip cartoonists like Bill Watterson or Charles Schulz, who influenced generations of people using the medium of comic strips. They are huge heroes of mine. Just they're in the pantheon of demigods of cartooning for me. And I studied their work endlessly growing up. I don't really have one workflow or I guess a rhythm that I am in at all times when I'm working. It changes dramatically depending on the thing that I'm doing. If I'm sitting to do a caricature commission, I'm gonna flick through a bunch of caricatures by Hirschfeld and Davis and Richmond and Steckley and people who I know are gonna get my brain into that headspace. And it kind of wires my brain to be ready to interpret the job at hand. So if I'm sitting down to do the comic strip, I'm going to go and read a whole bunch of comic strips. So there's no one process that I get into. My workflow depends entirely on the job. Like I might use, if I'm sketching ideas for the comic strip or for my newsletter or for something, I might use like a bamboo folio and just sketch with a pen on paper. And if I'm working on a big job that has a lot of detail in it, I'll have a big Wacom Cintiq, like a 27, that I'm working on, and I'll replace the nib with a felt tip nib to give myself a little bit more friction on the screen to make it feel like pencil on paper. And I'll use that for that kind of job. If I'm coloring a job that's very intricate, I'll probably take the Mobile Studio Pro out and just find a cafe or something and sit there and do that, so that at least what would otherwise be a kind of uninteresting, laborious job, at least I'm in an interesting surrounding. I don't have one singular workflow, and I think that works for me. I'm not really a creature of habit in that respect. I change my workflow all the time. I change my tools. I'm constantly experimenting with new materials and brushes in Photoshop and actual physical tools and inks, different papers, different tech, all the different kind of tech that keeps coming out. I'm always trying new technology because it might fit my workflow differently. It might change my style up a little bit. And as a freelance illustrator and cartoonist, you want to be able to adapt and be very malleable and be able to take on a job and do it correctly and do it to the best of your ability. The closest thing to a routine I have is waking up and going to sleep. They're the only two things that I have that I regularly would say that I do. I do comedy at night and I draw during the day. I could be doing anything from advertising work to caricature commissions to illustrations for posters, or doing the comic strip, or doing a digital animation, or I could be doing anything at all. The only thing that keeps me on track really is I have a bullet journal that I have all of my tasks in to kind of keep me on track about what's due when. But there's no daily routine. I do like to travel and get out a lot, and for that reason it helps to not have a routine necessarily. I can just work wherever I am. I work on the road. I have a mobile setup, so I can take a Mobile Studio Pro with me anywhere I go and still be able to complete the same amount of work that I would be able to if I was in the studio. And that's a big luxury. That's fantastic. And every single day is different than the last. I never fear the blank page because I never put myself in a position where I'm staring at a blank page. I will always capture ideas as they come to me, and I'll write them down in a notebook, or I'll put them down on my phone, so that when it comes time to use the ideas, I'm not sitting there just wondering what to draw or how to come up with something. I've already got a backlog of ideas or seeds of an idea that I can use. I learned a long time ago not to put myself in the position where, you know, I've got 365 comic strips to draw this year. I'm not going to think about 365 comic strips. I'm going to think about the 6 I have to do today. I'm never short of an idea, because when they come, I'm ready to capture them. Like in the middle of the night, I'll wake up with an idea, and it might not even be anything, but I'll write it down. And then in the morning, I'll look at it and go, what the hell? I can't even, that's not funny. But at least I captured it at the time. And I'm never short of any material that inspires me in cartooning. It's one of those art forms, like comedy, that you never quite perfect. You always just seek to improve, and you never stop learning.